Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Jones and I am a junior nursing major at Bloomsburg University. This semester, for my political science presentation, I decided to research the topic of child labor in India. I chose this specific topic because child labor is an extremely prevalent problem in the world today, but sometimes it seems as though it is overlooked. As opposed to other countries around the world, India is one of few who over the last few decades have established regulations regarding child labor. During this presentation, I hope to explain what child labor is, the prevalence of child labor in India, India's attempts to combat child labor, and give a comparison of child labor in India compared to other countries around the world. So, what is child labor? According to the International Labor Organization, child labor is defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to their physical and mental development. Examples of work done by child laborers are things like agriculture, manufacturing, which can include things such as clothing or footwear, mining, domestic service, or sale and trafficking, which is considered by most the worst and most dangerous form of child labor. Child labor has many negative consequences, but most importantly, it puts the child in danger, it impedes their education, and it interrupts the normal lifestyle of the child in general. Now to focus on child labor in India specifically. According to the statistics on child labor in India, according to childlineindia.org, the number of child laborers is constantly fluctuating. It is documented that India is home to the world's largest number of child laborers. According to the statistics, in 1991, 11.28 million child laborers were documented in India. In 2001, this number increased to 12.59 million child laborers, and in 2011, the number of child laborers was back down to 11.8 million. But it is important to remember that these statistics only represent the documented number of child laborers. As evident by these numbers, more needs to be done in India in order to end this cycle. Now on to causes. There are many reasons why the rates of child labor are so high, and the main reason in India is poverty. Families do not have basic needs available to them, so their young children are forced to work in order to provide for the family. Other causes of child labor include an increasing pay gap between the rich and the poor, lack of social security, and lack of quality education. Since children and families do not feel as though education is a necessity, they drop out of school and they enter the labor force. Now to discuss combating child labor and different acts and regulations that have been implemented in India. In 1986, India established the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act. The objective of this act was to prohibit the involvement of children, who is defined as anyone under the age of 14, in certain employments and regulate the conditions of their work. The act also stated that any violations would be punishable by imprisonment or a fine. As indicated by the statistics stated earlier, though, child labor was still a pressing issue even after the implementation of this act in 1986. Over the decades, more amendments have been introduced, and the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act has been revised many times, most recently in 2016. The Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Amendment Act of 2016 stated that it was an act to further amend the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act of 1986. This 2016 act prohibited the engagement of children in all occupations and prohibited the engagement of adolescents in hazardous occupations and processes. As stated earlier, India is one of few countries who over the decades have actively been attempting to abolish child labor, but more needs to be done to ensure that the laws are being followed. India may have implemented the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act of 1986 and revised that act most recently in 2016, but that is not enough. More needs to be done by law enforcement to ensure that laws are being followed and that the children of India are being kept safe. Now to compare child labor in India to child labor around the world. According to this map, the situation of child labor in India has been labeled a difficult situation. The epidemic of child labor in India is not as serious as it is, for example, in Africa, but it is also not as tame as it is in the US or Canada, for example. When comparing child labor in India to Africa, as stated, Africa is worse off. This is where India needs to be applauded for the work that they have done. They realized that the children in their country were at a loss, and they established acts and amendments in order to counteract the problem. And when comparing child labor in India to that of the United States, it is important to keep in mind that the main cause of child labor in India is poverty. The United States is much better off than India, so this would obviously indicate why the statistics of child labor in India are so much higher than that of the United States. So, in conclusion, I hope this video has provided you with some insight about what child labor is, the prevalence of child labor in India, India's attempts to combat child labor, and the comparison of child labor in India to other countries around the world. As stated, India took a step in the right direction implementing the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act of 1986, and most recently revising that act in 2016. But more needs to be done by government and law enforcement in order to keep the children of India safe.